Thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak today, and thank you for the introduction. We'll just get the PowerPoint slide up. It's always good coming back to Canberra. I lived here for 9 years, and if you scratch me, I still bleed lime green, and if my pulse always goes up that tiny fraction when I hear the word Canberra Raiders, so it's always good to be back here, even though I think the last few seasons haven't been the best, but Ricky will turn it around. Okay, in this presentation I'm going to talk about some work I've done with some colleagues relatively recently. So this was work we did in 2011, 2012. Emma and myself are listed here, but also we had colleagues such as Rebecca Bentley and Lawrence Lester involved in this project. And hopefully I'll get this to work. What I want to do in this presentation is provide a context and summary of what we know about housing and disability in Australia and how we need to understand housing and disability. Then I want to talk about the housing characteristics of Australian adults. I want to talk about housing careers, and then I want to talk about estimating the risk of homelessness for both the general population but also for the population of persons with various forms of disability. And I want to talk about, in particular about why intellectual or developmental disabilities are a particular focus here. Then I want to finish off with some discussion around issues around dwelling design and I guess what I think of as the broader social context of provision of accommodation for persons with intellectual disability and why it's so important. So I guess what we all know is that housing affordability is a major problem in Australia. We know that 1.2 million households in Australia roughly face difficult housing circumstances, and this isn't a cyclical problem. This is a problem that's been evident probably since about the year 2000. Rent and mortgage costs have increased significantly for many Australians by almost 50%, and we also see that there's a serious housing shortage. The National Housing Supply Council in their 2012 report estimated that the shortfall was around 30,000 dwellings across Australia, whereas in their forecasting by 2030 it might be as many as 200,000 dwellings. Significant shortfall. Of course, much of that shortfall is really a shortfall in terms of distribution rather than absolute numbers, because there are many people who own second or even third homes for various reasons. About 106,000 people were homeless at census night in 2011, according to the new and modified methodology. Interestingly, that number was very similar to the 2001 method enumeration of the homeless population on census night. And so a new method and new sets of policies hadn't really shifted the number of people enumerated as homelessness. I know in South Australia there's really no evidence that despite probably a decade of very focused work on homelessness, there's no much evidence that the homeless population is actually getting smaller. The Ryan government, when it came to power in 2002, made homelessness a major focus of its social inclusion initiatives. Huge review and huge refocusing of efforts, but homelessness remains a major problem in South Australia and something that they continue to give priority to in terms of social policy development. Up to 30% of low-income families across Australia, particularly renter families, go without meals or are forced to pawn possessions in order to pay rent. And I think that was one of the major findings of some work done by the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, particularly Peter Phibbs and Terry Burke, indicating just the level of extent to which people go without food in order to pay rent and keep a roof over their head. So first of all, I want to talk about some of the outcomes of our research, and this research was actually published on the, I can never remember, it's the National Homelessness Clearinghouse, the Australian Homelessness Clearinghouse, but if you look there and go looking for our research report on homelessness and disability, or non-psychiatric disability, you'll find the research. What you find is that if you look at the population without disabilities, which is the diagram to your immediate left, you'll find that, as expected, home purchase and outright home ownership remains the dominant tenure across all of Australia's population. If you then look across each of those other sets of bar charts, what you find is, firstly, persons with a disability, or households that include persons with a disability to be more precise, actually have a different tenure pattern. They're much less likely to be in home purchase. Some groups are more likely to be outright homeowners, and that's an important point. And they're also much more likely to be private renters, and in particular public renters. And I draw your attention to the fact that, I don't know if I've got a pointer on this one, persons with intellectual disability are much more reliant on the population, on public rental housing than any other group that we identify there. And they're also much less likely to be in home purchase than any other group that we identify there, about 27% compared to almost 60% for the Australian population overall. So, key message here is that, firstly, persons with a disability and their households occupy different forms of tenure compared to the rest of the Australian population. Secondly, that persons with a disability aren't one group, that if you even break them down into 4 broad categories, you find there's significant differences. And as I'll discuss later, even if you're looking only at persons with intellectual disability, of course, it's wrong to suggest that all persons with intellectual disability are the same. The nature, severity and impacts of cognitive disability or intellectual disability, of course, vary considerably. So this is a complex issue with a complex set of challenges in a policy setting. And if we look at the distribution of persons or households with disabilities, physical disabilities dominate, psychological are important, sensory and speech are important, and intellectual disabilities are a 4th very important group overall. The other point I'd make, and it's probably evident to everyone here, is that psychological disability is the group most likely to experience homelessness. So if you look at the homeless population, estimates are that 80% of the homeless population have some form of a psychological disability or psychiatric disability. I've no reason to doubt that. One of the key issues is that, of course, people with a psychiatric disability often have comorbidities in terms of disabilities. And one of the issues that emerges from our research is that often people with intellectual disabilities acquire psychological disabilities after becoming homeless. So a very unfortunate but fairly typical story can be a young person growing up with intellectual disabilities, gets larger, reaches adulthood, becomes difficult in the family home. Parents or caregivers don't really know what to do. What do they do? They don't really do much. They don't address the problem. There's not support available for them. The person behaviour in the home becomes more challenging. They leave home. Somehow they end up either on the street or they end up in a shelter. They don't deal with it. And they acquire a psychiatric disability through that process. It might be exposure to substances, it might be exposure to violence, it might be exposure to poor living conditions, but they acquire a psychological disability on top of the intellectual disability. And partly that can be because people working in the homelessness shelters, stroke service provision, are used to diagnosing people with psychiatric disabilities when it may not truly be a psychiatric disability. So comorbidity is a major issue. You're not just looking at neat barriers in terms of what person presenting with one issue rather than a suite of issues. One of the key issues is that people with a disability in Australia tend not to be particularly mobile through the housing market. Now, what you can say is that that's actually a good thing because, in fact, they're stable, they have stable housing arrangements for them. But, of course, it's also a bad thing because it means that when we move through the housing market, we tend to move for fairly good reasons. We're adjusting our housing to meet our needs. And if we're not adjusting our housing to meet our needs, it means we may not be occupying the housing that best suits our needs at that point in time. So people with disabilities overall tend to have a mismatch, if you like, between their housing and their current set of needs. And some work we did for Huri on 21st century housing careers for persons with a disability clearly identified that as a major issue. Persons with a disability and their households were much more likely to want to move than the population overall. And of course, once again, we see some variation. And of course, persons with a psychological disability much more likely to have moved in the last 12 months, partly because homelessness is a process of moving from place to place. Also draw your attention to the fact that for many people, your health condition, your disability, is a major cause of why you move through the housing market compared to persons without disability as being or reporting a disability as a reason for moving through the housing market. And then if you look at low-income households, what we find, and this can be it's no surprise to anyone in this room, persons with disability are much poorer, and they have much greater difficulties in terms of paying their rent and mortgages. And we see once again a gradient, persons with a psychological disability at the top, and then persons with intellectual disability, second highest proportion of households on low incomes struggling to pay relatively high mortgages or rent, and also reporting relatively low rates of struggling to pay rent overall. Now, one of the things that I and my colleagues have worked on over the years is housing careers. So we've looked at housing careers, mainly in a report we produced for Huri called 21st Century Housing Careers in Australia's Housing Futures. And one of the things that we did is we talked about, first of all, the traditional approach of a housing ladder where young households start off at the bottom and they work their way up until they move from living with parents, private rental, public rental, all the way to outright ownership, the great Australian dream realised in many respects. And we suggested that that's not always the case, that in fact for many people, in fact your housing through the life course is in fact a series of transitions, and in fact it's really a game of snakes and ladders. Sometimes you're going up and sometimes you're going down. If you've ever been divorced or separated, you know what the downside looks like. You know, divorce is really bad for your housing career. I just don't recommend it to anyone as part of their housing strategy over the life. Honestly, I don't. And if you then look over here, you see something, we talk about the life course over period. So life ending at age 82. Most of us in this room actually get more than 82. If you're a woman, age 60 in South Australia at the moment, you'll get to 90. That's your life expectancy. But you see a period where you move from various tenures, and then you get series period of both incomes and expenditure, and various times your income is greater than your expenditure, which is good, and various times your expenditure is greater than your income, which is not good. And we then talk about the impact of inheritance, or show the impact of inheritance, being cared for, providing care to others, which is increasingly an important part of people's life experiences in Australia, and of course the really bad thing of divorce, which has an immediate and direct impact on tenure for many people. But if we talk about people with the housing careers of people with a disability, what we're talking about is something different. We're talking about a number of things. We're talking about low incomes, we're talking about high housing costs, we're talking about limited options within the housing market, limited capacity to find paid work, which is really important, and the costs associated with their disability as well. So if we look at the 4 disability types that we examined, we find a different pattern. So we find persons with a disability, developmental disability or intellectual disability, find a flat housing career, often got relatively few options available to them, particularly if their disability means they can't find paid work or they need care. And in this example, we were talking about households that were living essentially in independent living units, which is the term they used in Victoria. Over here, mobility impairment through injury, going through the anticipated life course and housing trajectory, typical of Australians, and then you come off your motorbike, acquire a brain injury or become paraplegic, and all of a sudden your housing career becomes somewhat limited. And then you move mobility impairment from birth, sensory disability and psychiatric disability, including significant periods of homelessness and very low incomes and excessive below expenditure. Well, one of the things we want to do is we want to talk about the risk of homelessness. And so in the 2011-2012 piece of work, we actually did some work where we looked at the factors that can lead to persons becoming at risk of homelessness. And so we were able to develop an index of the risk of homelessness. So it's not necessarily homeless per se. These aren't people reporting they were homeless, but they had the characteristics of people who were homeless, if you can understand and appreciate that difference. And what we looked at, IRHR stands for Index of Relative Housing Risk, and that's the risk of becoming homeless. So, so at one extreme, if I can go back, which I don't think I can, well, I'll just show you on this side. At one extreme, what you see is you have a population overall, it's the black line, that's the general risk of homelessness for the Australian population, and it's roughly a normal distribution. On the other hand, you've got the bar charts, which show you what's the relative risk of homelessness for the population affected by different types of different types of disability. So for physical disability, for sensory disability, for intellectual disability, and for psychological disability. Now, what you find is that, in fact, for some forms of disability, the risk of homelessness, which is 7, 8 and 9, high risk of homelessness. So for sensory disability, it's actually lower than the general population as we calculated it. For the persons with a psychological or psychiatric disability, it's higher than the general population, but that's exactly what we would expect. So it's sort of ground truthing or providing face evidence that the index is measuring something that we would expect. But what we found, to our somewhat surprise, is that in fact, very few people with intellectual disabilities had low risk of homelessness, but more people had a higher risk of homelessness than we expected, and there was a significant middle cohort. So persons with intellectual disability were our unexpected finding in this piece of research, because what we found is that they were at high risk of homelessness, and we didn't actually anticipate that when we started this piece of work. We expected this, we didn't expect this, and we probably didn't expect this. Why the difference between sensory and intellectual? Because I think we have better policies, programs and procedures for dealing with sensory disability than we have for intellectual disability. Intellectual disability is a much more complex policy task or ask than sensory disability. Royal Society for the Blind. We have a specialist pension for persons who lose their sight. There are well-developed communities of deaf people. There are well-developed communities of persons with vision impairment. You don't necessarily find that in the intellectual disability field. Onset of disability might also have an impact as well. Thank you very much. So differential risk of homelessness highlights groups at extreme risk of homelessness, and within our population with intellectual disabilities, what we find is schooling, employment restrictions, intellectual disabilities are major challenges in terms of your risk of homelessness. So exposure is not evenly distributed, and these two groups here, psychological disabilities and mental illness, as reported in the General Social Survey, are actually as expected, but the fact that schooling, employment restrictions and intellectual disabilities are actually a major problem. I guess the key message I want to give to you is that one of the things that we found is that, somewhat to our surprise, having a mild intellectual disability was actually a major challenge. We would have assumed that there was a gradient. The greater your disability, the greater your risk in terms of intellectual disability. But of course, if you've got a considerable disability, there are government supports. It's when you're just off the pace that you're really at risk. And if you have schooling difficulties, learning difficulties, mild intellectual disabilities, you're not going to be competitive in Australia's labour market in 2012, 2006, 2002. And that puts you at risk. And often you behave, interact, and do everything in a way that people accept within the general community, but you're at risk because you're making poor decisions, you're at risk because you're not able to get into the labour market, etc. I just want to make a couple of points about design. I think there's actually very little work in Australia on dwelling design in terms of persons with intellectual disability, but I'll give you what I've been able to glean over time. First of all, Building Code of Australia doesn't actually make any mention of intellectual disability, and that's something we're thinking about, and that's something that could probably be addressed in various ways. There are twice as many intellectually disabled Australians as there are vision impaired, so that's a significant gap. One of the key issues with persons with intellectual disability in terms of dwelling design itself is the issue about wayfinding. You need to have dwellings which allow easy wayfinding. How do you find your way through? How do you walk into a building and immediately know where you should be going? I walked into this building and I had to ask where I was going. So, you know, I don't think I've got an intellectual disability. If I did have an intellectual disability, it would be a problem. Wayfinding is important. Dwelling design needs to assist the process of wayfinding, and these PowerPoints are provided to our organisers, so I won't go through them. But essentially, you need things to be clear, you need to be concise, you need to have signage which is consistent, which is legible, which uses culturally accepted colours for various forms of signage. You need to have clear line of sight. I walk into a building, I see the table I want to go to, I see the building or room I want to go to, and that is where I go to straight away. That's the sort of design we need. I'll just move on because I've got some conclusions to make and I'm almost out of time. I guess there are a couple of things to consider. One is, yes, there are things to say about building design, but building design involves consultation with persons with intellectual disability. It involves wayfinding, it involves legibility. But really, we need to be thinking more broadly about the building design or the design of housing for persons with intellectual disability. Working with non-government organisations in South Australia, one of the things they emphasise is the broader social context, and the literature does this as well, the broader social context of accommodation provided. So it's about not providing concentrations of persons with a disability. There's a program recently on the ABC called Dream Home, where 3 or 4 adults with Down syndrome are moved into an independent living away from their parents, and they track them through that process. It's been critiqued in the disability community because they put all people with intellectual disability in one room, or in one dwelling. In fact, the preferred model is you mix them up with persons with a disability and persons without a disability. And we need to be thinking about that broader social context. We need to acknowledge that there is a risk of homelessness for this group. We need to acknowledge that this risk is greater than it is for other persons with a disability in many instances, and that we need to consider how persons with relatively mild disabilities are going to be affected by this process. So it's about supply, it's about good design, it's about social setting. Thank you very much.